Hello everyone and welcome to your week 2 video. Hopefully we have the vast majority of the kinks worked out of the shell at this point. I appreciate those of you who have pointed out some of the inconsistencies. This is part of the joy of transferring from one learning platform to another. The last time I taught this course it was still in the e-college format, and so the transition from one platform to another has not been quite as smooth as I would have liked. So I very much appreciate your patience, and to those of you who have pointed out anything that has been amiss, and ideally between myself and Blackboard we have all of the inconsistencies worked out. Now that we're in week 2, hopefully you have a sense of how the class is going to run, of when things are due and how to do them. You are finishing up your week 1 posts as I'm recording this video, and so I will be very curious to see how you all do on those. You will notice that I am requiring you to integrate the course material into your posts, and so that's a really important thing, to be able to use the course material as part of your conversation with this class, as part of what supports the kinds of claims that you're making. And so you need to be sure that you're citing and that you're citing it properly according to APA. And if you have any questions about that, please feel free to reach out. We are moving into our discussion on identities and on communities, and this can often be a particularly politically and ideologically charged section of this class. As you'll notice, we're talking about issues like race and gender and class and sexuality, and so it's really important that we again remember that you are dealing with other humans in this class, and granted we aren't seeing each other in class and we aren't communicating face to face, and online platforms can often encourage those who want to be negative or who say things that don't have the same kind of social control mechanisms as a class. And so I just want to make sure that everybody recognizes that we are all human, we are all people, and it's important for us to put that at the forefront, to practice empathy, to practice being kind, to practice being compassionate, even though we probably won't agree, and that's okay. But there is a way in which we can engage with one another that is respectful and that values each other as people, that does not then sort of do this downward spiral into disrespectful language or dehumanizing language. And so I want to make sure that you all recognize that that's a very important part of this class. It's difficult to talk about issues of justice if people don't feel like they can say who they are or what they believe. And so keep that in mind. We all have complex identities, and our overlapping identities, that the kinds of identities that matter to us and the kinds of identities that are seen by other people, all matter as we sort of make sense of what justice is and the kinds of injustices people experience on a daily basis. Your readings, there are a lot, so I suggest you start now. There's lots and lots to read, and these readings barely skim the surface. It's so hard to pick readings for this section because there's so many great things out there that we could talk about, or readings that we could do, or videos we could watch. So I always have a hard time whittling down my choices for this week. Some are more dense than others. You will notice that as you are reading them. Some are very quick, some are very written in a way that's very accessible. Some are more theoretically dense, sort of what Bell Hooks talked about in her theory as a liberatory practice piece. Some of these are more heady pieces, but have very good information in them. And so in particular, I'm thinking about the Borderlands reading, your Dark Matter reading, and your Demarginalizing the Intersections reading. All are very academically dense, and so they are presenting ideas that are theoretically and philosophically dense, but also that are legal jargon and legalese. And so be sure that you take some time with those to really work your way through them. So for this week, you have 2 videos in addition to the readings that you need to watch. One is embedded into your shell, and that is the Prom Night in Mississippi video. And then the other, unfortunately, since it's streamed through the library, I can't actually get it into the shell since it's not in a film on demand. And so there's a link that provides you access that is streamed for free through the ASU library. So the White Like Me video by Tim Wise is in the, just follow the link and it'll take you to the library. Okay, so your readings for this week. You have Tim Wise's Membership is a Privilege, wherein he talks about experiences of being white and the privilege that goes with that. You'll notice that there are a couple readings and a video on whiteness, and it's very important. And I want to make the disclaimer now that, particularly given what happened in Charlottesville last week, that we tread very lightly on this topic, because these readings are not meant to make people feel guilty. They're not meant to make you defensive. I am clearly white. I experience a great amount of privilege because I am white, and it's important that we recognize that we recognize the kinds of systems and institutions in place that prioritize one skin color over other skin colors, and to really deconstruct this notion of race as a social construction. As I've said before, it is real, race is real, right? But the social constructed nature of it is that the value that we place on it is different, and it changes over time. So we can even look in the United States. The historical definition of race in the United States has changed, right? So what it meant to be white is different today than what it meant to be white 100 years ago. And a lot of that change has less to do with the fact that skin pigmentation has changed and more to do with the ways in which those in power want to maintain power. And so it's very important that we recognize that. This is not a matter of you as an individual white student feeling as if this should make you feel guilty. Instead, it's a matter of recognizing, are there things that white people in general experience? Are there advantages that they experience by an unearned physical characteristic? Because the only reason that I'm white is because both my parents happen to be white. So I didn't do anything to earn that whiteness, right? I didn't work really hard to be white. And so it's really important that we think about that. And particularly amidst this political conversation about privilege, about whiteness, about neo-Nazism, we have to be very, very careful in the ways in which we talk about these things. So again, that's Tim Wise's Membership Has Its Privileges. He is also the one who did the video that you'll watch. Peggy McIntosh's Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack is a great one. It's a little dated, so as you read her list, you'll recognize that some things seem a little silly. It was written in 1988, but it remains a very important piece as we think about unpacking those privileges that we get that we don't even think about. So, for example, finding a flesh-colored Band-Aid, or for those who wear makeup, flesh-colored makeup. You know, there are things that white people in particular have reap advantage of for no other reason but that they are white. And they're so normalized and part of our daily experience that we don't even recognize them. You also will be reading a piece about microaggressions, and so these are the more covert aggressions that happen in terms of racial experience or sexuality or gender identity. And so this piece is looking less at the more overt kinds of racism that we tend to see, or the overt kind of sexism, and more at covert kinds and language and interactions that occur that reinforce negative racial politics or negative sexual politics, or oppression, or reinforce oppression in very, very covert ways, right? So it's little things like, wow, you're really smart for a girl, or telling a boy you throw like a girl, things like that. So it's looking at microaggressions. You also have a piece on racial politics, which is, like I have mentioned, one of the more dense pieces. He has a pretty scathing discussion about racial politics in the United States. And so I want you to look carefully at that. It's a relatively short piece, but it is jam-packed full of thought. And so take your time with that piece and really think about what it means to think about race and racism in the United States. You'll also have a piece on borderlands and illegality and what she calls the space of non-existence. And this piece, I've mentioned it's a theoretically dense piece. It's an ethnography, and so it's written a bit differently than the other pieces that you'll read for this week. And what she's trying to do is express this experience that those who are undocumented in the United States live in. So this non-existence that they live in, both legal non-existence, where they don't actually count or they aren't actually a person, they lack this sort of personality personhood, but also this sort of spatial non-existence that occurs in borderlands. This is a particularly interesting piece, I think, for us to read as we, well, I used to live in Arizona. Many of you still do, but given that ASU is in Arizona, when we think about the Southwest region and the borderlands and this new talk of a wall, it's important for us to think about the humanity and the people that are involved, less about it's important to still think about the policies and the politics of it, but to also think about the people. Let's see what else. Oh, you're going to read a chapter called The Complexity of Identity by Tatum. And here she's really trying to look at all of our identity, right? So we think about all of these different identity categories that we possess and how those identity categories not only make sense for us, so who am I? How does my identity as a white person, as a woman, as a mother, as a person who's in the middle class, how do all of these, as a heterosexual, all of these categories, as an able-bodied individual, how do all of these categories help me understand and define who I am, both for myself, but also how you, as students in my class, read me and understand me and experience my identity. And so it's a really interesting conversation about dominant and subordinate groups and how the dominant group has their identity normalized in everyday experience. So often when people talk about who they are, white people don't tend to say, I am white. Or people who are heterosexual don't tend to say, I am heterosexual. Whereas those who are not white or those who are not heterosexual tend to have that as part of their identity when they talk about themselves. So thinking about dominant and subordinate categories and how we have a hierarchy of identity in the United States, and those who do not embody what is normal are often those who are marginalized to the most severe, right? So the more identity categories that are not the norm, the more marginalized your experience tends to be. Okay, two more. You have a reading from Anne Fausto Sterling, who is a really great scientist. She is a biologist who studies gender and sexuality. And so she provides a very interesting conversation about how we understand the body. Because often when we think about definitions of body, we think very biology. We think that our bodies are biologically predetermined. Therefore, our gender identity, our sexual identity, and our actual physical sex, i.e. the genitalia that we have, is predetermined by biology. When in fact, most of the way that we understand the body is a socially constructed phenomenon. And so in this chapter in particular, she is looking at issues of sexual orientation and how historically and contextually we have understood homosexuality in particular, but looking beyond that to things like gender identity. And so she provides a look from a multidisciplinary perspective on how we understand homosexuality and how we then have legislated issues of sexuality, right? So when we think about sexuality, we think about it as being personal, as being the ways in which we understand ourselves and our partners, or not, or if you happen to be asexual, not our partners, how you understand yourself, but how we've legislated it, both legislating in terms of those who are same-sex oriented, right? So same-sex marriage, don't ask, don't tell policies, defining marriage as a man and a woman, but also we've legislated sexuality for heterosexuals. So think about the Virginia v. Loving case, right, where we couldn't have interracial marriage. And so these are all things to think about as we start to understand how justice plays into our sexual identities. And then the very last piece is Kimberly Crenshaw's Demarginalizing the Intersections. And so here, this is sort of a very foundational piece when we're thinking about intersectionality, when we're thinking about how we understand how our identities are overlapping and intersecting, and how that either makes us recognizable, particularly for her, she's looking at the legal system, or unrecognizable. So she's looking at 3 specific court cases that could not understand the identity of a Black woman, right? So, for example, in the DeGraff and Reed v. General Motors case, Black women were suing because they couldn't get jobs at General Motors. General Motors is saying, well, no, you can, because you could be... Start that again. So what she is arguing in this is that Black women were particularly marginalized because they were Black and because they were women. But GM was saying, well, you can't be. You can't take this apart. And the court didn't understand it either, because the court's saying, well, if you're black, you can get a job at GM because, look, there are black engineers, but those happen to be male. And if you were a woman, yes, you could get a job because there were women who were in the secretarial and administrative positions, but they did not. They were white women. And so the sole experience of being a black woman made them particularly marginalized, and they were not recognizable. But the court was saying, well, no, you can't sue on sex or race discrimination because there happen to be women who work there and there happen to be black people who work there. But what the court didn't recognize is that it wasn't that they were suing as women, and it wasn't that they were suing as black. It was that they were suing particularly as black women. And that intersectional identity, those overlapping categories, made it so that their experience was particularly marginalized. And so she talks about 3 cases in which the court just couldn't understand that the experiences of black women is different than the experience of black men and of white women. And so it's it again is a more theoretically dense article, because it's very much talking about legalese and legal language and legal writing, but it's a very important piece. And I know a lot of you posted in your introductory posts that you want to go into law school. So again, this is a good example of breaking down the law and looking at legal language and the ways in which legal language often pushes those who are not in dominant categories to the margins. All right, so that was a lot. Lots to talk about this week, and I truly, as I've said, I barely scratched the surface. And so remember that you have this week your discussion board post and your response. I have actually given you a prompt to respond to, so you have a very brief article to look at, and then use the 2 films that you watched this week to respond to that. And then you'll have to do a response to a classmate, or 2 or 3, however many you want to respond to. And then you'll also have your quiz. And so if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. You've already made use of the hallway conversations. If you have very specific questions to you and your own issues with class, or your own questions about the content, be sure to reach out to me. I am around if you need me. And one other reminder that, remember, I live in Michigan, and so I am 3 hours ahead of you. And so if you are trying to get me to answer a question in a short amount of time, and you happen to be writing to me in what's in the middle of the night in Michigan, you likely will not get a response yet. So keep in mind that I am 3 hours ahead of you in terms of when you are asking questions and when you are seeking assistance. So have a lovely week, and I look forward to reading your work and engaging with you about issues of social identities and communities.